Welcome everyone to the North Carolina Botanical Gardens 2020 Year of the Wildflower Exhibition finale. I'm Joanna Massey-Lalikas, and I'm the Director of Education with the North Carolina Botanical Garden. We thank you all for joining us virtually today on this cold winter day with most of the fall wildflowers visible as seed heads at this time. We're recording this presentation and we'll be sharing the recording with registered participants in the next week or so. If you remain in the webinar, you're consenting to the recording. And because the size of our audience, your video and audio are muted for the program. We're very excited to be able to wrap up our Year of the Wildflower theme with Dr. Caitlin McDonough-McKenzie, who will be sharing her own plant love stories that drew her into her plant-focused career, and also about a project that she and her colleagues established called Plant Love Stories. We have Lauren Green, Jana Starr, and Liesl Holder. We're all available to you in the chat feature if you run into any technical issues with the Zoom, and Lauren will also be helping us with the moderation of the Q&A with Caitlin. So this talk brings us to the end of our programming for our 2020 Year of the Wildflower exhibition. We spent 2020 celebrating and advocating for biodiversity with a year-long focus on wildflowers. We've been excited to have so many of you in our programs. Our garden's mission, as so many of you are already familiar with, is to inspire understanding, appreciation, and conservation of plants, and to advance people's relationships with nature in a sustainable way. And we really hope that this Year of the Wildflower helped to expand your relationship with native wildflowers and plants generally. So I'm going to ask a few questions of you all in the audience, and if any resonate with you, feel free to type a short response about it in the chat, and I'll share some of them out loud once I get through the questions anonymously. Things that we were hoping to do. Have you learned about a new native wildflower this year? Have you planted new native wildflowers in your garden or in containers at your home? Have you learned about native wildflowers that grow along our roadsides? Have you learned how to propagate native wildflowers? Did you make art related to native wildflowers? Did you design a wildflower garden? Did you bring some wildness into your garden with native wildflowers? Did you learn something new about the importance of wildflower conservation? Did you learn a new way to identify native wildflowers? Do you have a new favorite wildflower? Or do you have a new plant love story that has evolved for you? Type any responses you have to these questions in the chat. I see someone took a botanical drawing class through another botanical garden, UNC Charlotte. That's terrific. I know we've seen a lot of visitation here at the garden, and hoping you all have been appreciating and enjoying time in nature, which is so crucial during this time. Somebody else posted, I learned to propagate ferns from a webinar by Ralston Arboretum. Terrific. I saw the flower of a rattlesnake plantain for the first time. I use an app to help me identify plants on my walks. That's terrific. Anything else? I'll just give another moment or two for folks to post. Buying native wildflower seeds from the Botanical Garden gift shop at a 10% discount. Terrific. I've drawn wildflowers almost every week. I really loved the horse mint and got them at your garden shop. I learned to use the iNaturalist app better. I finally had time to ID some wildflowers in my yard. I planted natives and achieved Audubon bird-friendly certification. I seeded native thistle that bloomed for the first time this year in my pollinator garden. All of these are wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these. Any last comments before we move on? Okay, I think this is really great. I'm thrilled to see what you all have been doing and look forward to hearing more. Feel free to post them in the chat as we go. Now we'll move on to our introduction of our speaker. Today we have with us Dr. Caitlin McDonough McKenzie. She's a visiting assistant professor in environmental studies at Colby College. Her research focuses on plant ecology and conservation biology in the Maine mountains. She received a BA in environmental science and public policy from Harvard, an MS in ecological planning from the University of Vermont, and a PhD in biology from Boston University. Her doctoral research was focused on climate change, species loss, and spring phenology in and around Acadia National Park in Maine. She completed a David H. Smith Conservation Research Fellowship at the University of Maine and a George Melendez Wright Climate Change Fellowship at the University of Vermont. She has taught courses on climate change, New England forests, conservation paleobiology, and other classes at Emerson College, University of Maine, and Colby College. This year, the Ecological Society of America awarded her the George Mercer Award for an outstanding ecological research paper published as a younger researcher. She also serves on the council of the New England Botanical Club and is a co-founder of Plant Love Stories, a project that fosters and shares stories about plants that have shaped people's lives. She was the lead author on a letter to the editor in 2019 to Plants, People, and Planet titled, "We do not want to cure plant blindness. We want to grow plant love." She'll share more about the Plant Love Stories approach to building botanical capacity in her talk. Caitlin, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you so much, Joanna. Let me get my screen shared and we'll get started. It's so nice to be able to join you guys all from snowy Boston. And I'm hoping this will be a nice kind of lunchtime story time. So I first just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking today from the homeland of the Pawtucket people, and that in this talk, I'll be sharing research and stories from the homelands of the Abenaki, Wampanoag, Wabanaki, and Penobscot peoples. And start there. Actually, I'll hold here for a second and just rearrange my screen so I can see what I'm doing. All right. And I just want to point out that I have 4 plant love stories for you. And so I've divided this talk into 4 chunks, and I'll tell a story, and then there'll be time for questions and discussion before moving on to the next story. And we can actually get started with another poll. And let's see if I can do that. There we go. So I just want to know if everyone out there has a plant love story. And you don't need to share what it is yet, but just thinking about, do you have one? And I'll say that I fell in love with alpine plants at the bottom of a mountain. And you heard my bio, and you know that I study plants in the mountains above tree line, and I am mostly focused on what's happening on top of the mountains in Maine. But this was the line that came to me as I was typing up my first plant love story, which was the 3rd plant love story we published for a little new website in late February 2018. And I'm going to close the poll so I don't get distracted by being excited by everyone. But you can see that a lot of you do have plant love stories, and I'm excited to hear them. So I fell in love with alpine plants at the bottom of a mountain, and I wrote this in 2018. And it wasn't quite the bottom, but it was well below tree line in New Hampshire, 2,700 feet. In college, I worked as an environmental educator at a backcountry hut in New Hampshire's White Mountains. And that is me giving a program in a prom dress. Today, I'm a little bit more formal. Many of these huts were high mountain huts, or they still are high mountain huts. They're perched just at tree line for beautiful hikes through alpine communities with Sound of Music style panoramic views of open summits. My hut, Zealand Falls Hut, was not a high mountain hut. Our elevation was 2,700 feet, and we were surrounded by lowland trees like paper birch and striped maple. But Zealand Falls had waterfalls. During the lull of midday, the post-breakfast quiet, when all of last night's guests had hiked on to higher peaks and this night's guests were still trudging up the trail, I spent hours wading up the Zealand River, lounging in the rills and climbing the falls. Little clumps of buttercup yellow flowers hung to the moss-covered rocks in the middle of the falls, mountain avens. In New Hampshire, mountain avens belong to much higher elevations. This rare plant with a truly weird post-glacial distribution is endemic to the White Mountain Alpine Zone and coastal Nova Scotia. In New Hampshire, mountain avens are supposed to be high mountain hut plants, not inland valley forest plants. And they didn't grow on the banks of the river or anywhere in the forest around the hut, just the waterfall. They seemed to know what I knew, that the falls were a cool retreat from the July heat, an escape from the hot and crowded hut porch. Living with mountain avens and sharing their waterfall microclimate for a summer made me feel like I had a secret alpine plant pet. I actually spent 2 summers working at Zealand Falls. I loved those avens and the hut and the valley around it so much that I came back again before my senior year of college. And as I write in this story, years later, I started graduate school and joined a research project that brought me back to the alpine plants around the high mountain huts in the White Mountains. But I always made a point to hike back to Zealand Falls to see my original alpine loves. And this is true. I returned to the White Mountains as a master's student, and I studied mountain avens along with 5 other alpine species. And I had no study plots at Zealand Falls, but I tried to visit on my days off. Now I study alpine plant communities in deep time, and the avens don't grow on my summits in Maine, but I think about them a lot because I study refugia, places that have supported persistent alpine communities through the past 15,000 years of climate change. My summers with the low elevation mountain avens are a reminder that plants grow in weird places and that I need to be prepared for surprises in my data. And so that's my mountain aven story. Any questions or stories that you all want to share out?
Caitlin, I'll just mention a few of the other topics that came in after we were asking about plant love stories earlier too. Someone said that they had wildflowers pop up in her garden that she didn't even plant this year. We planted more native wildflowers and native habitat gardens and designed wildflowers in a plan for a friend, and always learned something new from each lecture. And the seed packets from NCBG all thrived in the home garden.
Well, I'm going to throw out another poll and ask if there's a plant in your origin story, since mountain avens are my scientist origin story. And mountain avens are part of my origin story, but I wanted to also share the origin story for Plant Love Stories, the project. And I also want to point out that our artwork, our logo is designed by Bonnie McGill, who's wearing the red hat in the middle here. These are the 9 Plant Love Stories collaborators. So Plant Love Stories is brought to you by the Smith Conservation Fellows. We're a group of postdocs. And as we write on our website, plantlovestories.com, we are conservation biologists who work and play in forests and prairies, oceans and lakes, mountains and caves, farms and cities, streams and rivers, deserts and wetlands, and all the places in between. And big chunks of this story that I'm about to tell are excerpts from the paper that we wrote together in 2019. We do not want to cure plant blindness. We want to grow plant love. So we've got a pretty good split of plants in different people's origin stories. All right, so In January 2018, the Smith Fellows spent a week in Washington, D.C. on a policy retreat. My roommate for the week was Dr. Becky Barak. She's a plant ecologist at Chicago Botanic Garden who studies prairie restoration. And Becky and I had known each other when we were PhD students. And through a combination of sneaky internet research and overlapping mentors, we realized that we were both finalists for the Smith Fellowship in late 2016. And I remember sitting in my PhD lab and practicing interview questions with Becky over the phone, probably actually about this time in 2016. And we knew that each cohort of Smith Fellows is just 5 conservation scientists, and we were sure that they wouldn't take 2 plant ecologists in 1 year, but they did. And so in 2018, we were on this DC retreat, and it was packed with panels and meetings. We met with congressional staffers. We had this long week, and towards the end of a long day, at the end of the week, we were in a hotel conference room, just feeling really burnt out, discussing how to impact policy and what progress we'd made on a really major literature review. And I was wilting. And then Becky said, I just want to do something fun. I want to talk about plant love. Plant Love Stories is a collection of personal stories about how plants have shaped our lives. As conservation researchers, we often see plants as a backdrop, a hazy, nondescript habitat for the charismatic megafauna. And yet almost everyone has a story about a plant. The Venus flytrap that you didn't realize needed water as well as flies. The delicious fruitiness of fresh from the garden tomatoes. The unexpected utility of an alder tree in the middle of a fieldwork disaster. Since its launch on Valentine's Day 2018, Plant Love Stories has published weekly stories from plant ecologists, scientists who are stridently not botanists, artists, parents, kids, professors, and undergrads. The beloved plants are houseplants, garden plants, greenhouse plants, wild plants, trees, seeds, tattoos, and million-year-old fossils. The growing collection of stories reminds us that we all share emotional connections to wild growing things. We believe that everyone has a plant love story, and we are collecting and sharing these stories to show how plants affect us all. Plant love stories can be written and submitted by anyone, including you. Contributions range from humorous to heart-wrenching to heartwarming. We believe that connecting with people's emotions is an effective way of deepening their awareness of plants. By nurturing a broader social discussion and awareness of the value of plants to human and ecosystem health, we strive to increase public interest in plant conservation. When we first began Plant Love Stories, we talked amongst ourselves about our discomfort with the popular term plant blindness. Plant blindness as a metaphor first appeared in the literature in 1999. Those persons afflicted with the condition known as plant blindness exhibit symptoms such as the following: thinking that plants are merely the backdrop for animal life, failing to see, notice, or focus attention on plants in daily life, misunderstanding what plants need to stay alive, overlooking the importance of plants in one's daily affairs. A broad amalgam of underappreciation, unawareness, and indifference toward plants was packaged in this tidy metaphor. But we contend that plant blindness is an inaccurate metaphor for the wide-ranging phenomena that Wandersee and Schussler describe in their foundational papers. The term plant blindness does not refer to a person's inability to visually see plants. It is referring to an inability to distinguish among plant species or appreciate their value. This metaphorical plant blindness can manifest as a barrier to understanding and conserving the remarkable diversity of plant species that support human and other animal life. The term is catchy, and major news outlets have adopted it. However, behind the enthusiasm to engender greater appreciation for the plant kingdom, the very language used to describe biases against plants, plant blindness, exposes our own implicit biases. Plant blindness is a disability metaphor. Disability metaphors often assume that all people experience and sense the world in the same way, that able bodies are the default, and that disabled bodies are lacking or less than. The term plant blindness is ableist and problematic because it positions blindness as a deficit that must be cured and negates the possibility that blind people can lead lives that are full of rich sensory flora experiences. Ableism refers to the continual devaluing of disability, or the belief that disability is an inherently negative state of being. The Census Bureau estimates that nearly 1 in 5 people in the US reported a disability, which means we are implicitly devaluing many of our friends, family members, colleagues, students, and neighbors when we use ableist language. The problem with the term plant blindness, as well as all disability metaphors, is that they contribute to the implicit stereotypes of people with disabilities. Using these metaphors, we suggest that disabilities are conditions that require cures or preventions and highlight our association of disability with something bad. Disability metaphors use perceptions of disabilities as tropes. These metaphors are tired and imprecise. We have a duty to conserve plants for the health of current and future generations. To do that, we, as a community of scientists and plant lovers, need to move plants from the background and into the foreground of people's hearts and minds. Effective movements need a clear, unifying rallying cry. And we've made a decision not to use curing plant blindness as ours. Instead, we would like to encourage an honest and inclusive discussion about the disenfranchising and exclusionary term plant blindness. Plant Love Stories values a diversity of experiences with plants. An appreciation of plants is not just about seeing plants, it can encompass all of our senses and emotions. Our collection of stories are also about smelling plants, like milkweeds, prairie dropseed, and allergy trees. Hearing plants that have funny voices and divulging secrets to our cacti. Tasting fruits like tomatoes, mangoes, and lemons, and leaves like garlic mustard. Feeling the texture of plants by rubbing dandelions under our chins, or scraping our legs as we wade through Juncus marshes. Our relationship with plants can be a vehicle for discovering deep personal insights, forming lifelong relationships with other humans, getting through serious illness, and remembering those we have lost. We believe that everyone has a plant love story in their lives, even if they do not think they do. We do not share these stories to cure or prevent or stop anything. Rather, we bring attention to these emotional relationships that already exist. And that is our plant love story letter to the editor about plant blindness, or big excerpts from it. So I'm happy to take any questions on that or talk more about growing plant love.
All right, Caitlin, we've already got a couple questions. The first one is, do people have more than one plant love story?
Yes, there's many plant love stories. And I'm going to share another one of my plant love stories, but yeah, I think plant love stories are something that grow over your lifetime and can definitely propagate more and more.
We also had a question, if you could explain exactly what you mean by origin story in this context.
So I wanted to share this in part because a lot of the plant love stories that we receive that people contribute, especially that professors and researchers contribute, are about a spark plant, the plant that got them started down their career path. And I really felt like mountain avens were that plant for me, where I went into my time working as an environmental educator, really thinking that I would end up on the policy side of things, and just really fell in love with this idea that mountain avens that are supposed to be on top of the mountain could grow in these weird little crevices in the waterfall. And it really just kind of changed the direction of my career. And similarly, the plant love stories origin story, where all of us are working so hard, again, on the policy side, trying to think about how our conservation research can impact policy. And what ended up happening is that we were so burnt out by that experience, we wanted to do a fun group project. And then Plant Love Stories became this project that I think has a really deep impact on a lot of people and a lot of folks who maybe don't see themselves as engaging in conservation research. but now have a plant love story in a way to kind of get hooked into that narrative.
All right, we have a comment from our Director of Conservation, Johnny Randall, that we here at NCPG protect the germplasm of bent avens, Geum geniculotum, in our association with the Center for Plant Conservation, a high elevation endangered species.
That's so great. Those are the sister species to Geum pecki. That's great. I love finding out about the, kind of, there's each mountain range has its own idiosyncratic, like, here's our endemic and here's what we're trying to figure out about why its range is so weird. I really enjoy hearing about that from the sister species of my mountain avens.
We've got a couple more questions. What was the reaction from the journal to your letter about plant love stories and plant blindness?
Yeah, we had initially put together this letter to the editor because Plants People Planet was writing or had put together a special issue on plant blindness. And I believe that it was Becky Tonietto, who's in the top left of this picture, wearing a Plant Love Stories hat, who had reached out or had heard from the editor and reached out to ask if we could write a letter to the editor, because it was something that we had all talked about pretty extensively in 2018, but had never done anything front-facing about it. We just didn't use plant blindness on our website, and that was it. There wasn't an outward-facing explanation of that. And then when we came together to write that letter to the editor, I believe we had about 2 weeks before that issue was going to press, and the editors were really helpful and great about giving us feedback. And later that summer, Becky Brock and I were at a conference where the journal had like a booth set up, and we went over to talk to them, and they were so welcoming and excited. They took a picture of us and tweeted it. So it seemed to be a really important conversation, that they were excited to get a group of people to really articulate the feelings around it. Because I think it's a conversation that a lot of folks have been having internally, and there isn't that outward formal writing about why not. And it's something that we felt was important, and we also felt like really a little bit wary about it, because none of us identify as blind or there's just kind of this feeling that when you write about a disability that you don't represent, you don't want to misrepresent the community that you're trying to uplift.
All right, we've got several more questions, but I'm just gonna ask you one more on this stopping point. Could you please encapsulate your brief definition of plant love story?
A plant love story can be any story that centers a plant. And we have quite a few plant love stories that are actually plant hate stories, or talk about plants that people thought they hated. The alder story is one of those. It's a fieldwork story where somebody who hated having to kind of crawl through the alder thickets to get to their field sites one day realized they didn't have a pencil, and remembered from a natural history class or lab, I believe, that alders have a pith that you can actually write with, very similar to a lead pencil, and ended up keeping all their field notes that day from an alder pencil. My lab mate from my PhD, Lucy Ziff, wrote the Juncus story about how they hated wading through those Juncus marshes because they just cut up their legs, but it made them kind of take on this tough mentality of, well, we have to deal with this, and so we're gonna like turn it into our love story, because otherwise you end up just hating it.
All right, and I'll hold some questions for you for our next stopping point. And if anybody wants to keep adding some questions to our Q&A, we will make some more breaks to answer some more questions later on.
All right. So I'm going to put out the next poll. And this asks if you carry pieces of outdoor plants inside. And so I'm asking this question because every week we share plant love stories, and this project began as a collaboration between conservation scientists who wanted to celebrate the connections between people and plants. But in general, our careers are built on millions of observations of plant traits, or measurements of their seeds, or counts of their pollen. And so we end up spending weeks and months writing up these academic journal articles that flatten the touch and smell of plants into numbers and variables and plots. And with plant love stories, we get to center the importance of narrative storytelling in science communication, both within the scientific community and with broader audiences. And we do this because stories have power. They bring people together, they connect people with nature, and they help us bridge our research and our communities. And I want to tell a story right now that honors the pieces of plants that field scientists like myself and the Plant Love Stories co-founders, the plants that we bring indoors. So for me, in my career, that's been tree cores and pollen and herbarium specimens and twigs. And so some of you might have similar things that you bring inside, either for science or to decorate your houses. About 86% of people carry pieces of indoor plants outdoor plants inside. And so after I lived with my waterfall mountain mavens, my senior year of college, I took a seminar called Biological Conservation on Cape Cod and the Islands. I enrolled because my major, environmental science and public policy, was biology adjacent. My friend wanted to take it, and I'd already bailed on a different seminar with her, and there would be field trips. So this seminar taught me how to read a scientific paper and how to core a tree, prep the core, and measure the rings with meticulous, old school, we're talking dissecting scope and ruler style precision. In late October, we took a ferry from Woods Hole to Noshan Island. It's a little chunk of glacial moraine in the Elizabeth Islands off the southern coast of Cape Cod. And there are stands of nearly pure beech forests on this island. There's small stunted dwarf beech on the morainal knobs and ridges where coastal winds whip at their leaves and pull away the soil. And there are tall statured beech trees in the protected depressions. These are the same species, it's just a growth form that's determined by the environmental conditions. The dwarf beeches on the ridges are like a coastal Krumholtz. I recognize their growth form from my time in the mountains of New Hampshire, where spruces and fir trees at tree line bend low with twisted, stunted growth beat back by winds, ice, and harsh weather. The Krumholtz beech trees on the little rocky ridges of Noshan stood over us as we collected cores from their tall statured siblings in the depressions. These beech seeds had had the good fortune to land in a spot with more nutrient-rich soil, less drought, and less wind. We slid the cores into Dunkin' Donuts straws with masking tape to seal the ends and leaned back against the moraine with muffins from the bakery by the ferry and lukewarm coffee in our travel mugs. In the cores, we traced the history of the beech stand through their rings. Here was the hurricane of 1938. Here were the hard years with close together growth. And here were the release years as the shade tolerant trees finally stretched into the canopy. When I tell my origin story about how I became an ecologist, I usually talk about hiking in New Hampshire or the childhood trip with my grandparents when they took me to Acadia. I usually neglect Cape Cod and the dwarf peach trees. It was just an undergrad class, just a couple weekend field trips. But the practice of doing that field work, collecting and prepping my tree cores, it's really not different from the herbarium specimens I pressed and mounted as a master's student, the winter twigs that I helped to clip and set up in a phenology forcing experiment as a PhD student, the microscope slides of pollen that I am still identifying and counting from my postdoc research. So much of botanical work for scientists is indoors and on a small scale. We bring these slices of our study species into the lab. I became a botanist in part because I wanted to be outdoors. The greatest part of that Cape Cod seminar was not the pieces of the beech that fit into the Dunkin' Donuts slides or straws, but everything outside the straws, the field trips, the muffin that I ate leaning against that moraine, the walk under towering white cedars along a rickety boardwalk in an Atlantic white cedar swamp down the Cape in Wellfleet, the open heath on Martha's Vineyard, where heath hens were last seen in the 1930s. I loved that seminar, but on a practical level, my life as a botanist mostly resembles our weekly meetings in a classroom where we read and discussed scientific papers, and learned how to slide the cores from their Dunkin' Donuts straws onto a mount and sand them smooth to count and measure the rings. By the time we had pooled our data to graph dates of establishment for the beech trees, the connection between the physical tree on Noshawn Island and the numbers in a spreadsheet was already fuzzy. Now, as a paleoecologist, the line is even more blurred. I can't look at my pollen and point to a tree in a depression under a morainal knob with a small hole at coring height. Instead, my pollen merely hints at the ghost of a plant that grew 10,000 years ago, somewhere in the general area of the pond where I collected sediment. I have this one small piece of a plant, and it's kind of a stand-in for a whole historical community. The mundane indoor work of science demands this huge imagination to be able to follow the story from tree core to forest, from microscope slide to post-glacial vegetation. I was actually back at the White Cedar Swamp this month. I drove out with my kids and we spent a rainy day hiking on Cape Cod. My 5-year-old collected swamp oak acorns, flakes of bark with neon rain-soaked lichen, and pitch pine needles. Even after she parroted a sing-songy, take nothing but pictures, leave nothing but footprints, her pockets were lined with broken mussel shells and cedar berries. It's not lost on me that this is basically what I do as a scientist, but with the proper permits. A plant love story can honor a piece of a plant, the rings we count, the seeds we measure, the pollen we process and place on microscope slides. But plant love stories is also a chance to step out of the lab and step back from the peer-reviewed manuscripts and honor our relationship with the whole plant, the whole forest, the whole community. Humans are hardwired for listening and absorbing information in the format of stories, and plant love stories make space for narrative storytelling. And I think without this space, I wouldn't see the beech trees as a part of my scientist origin story. It was just an undergrad class, just a couple weekend field trips. We created plant love stories to share our stories and our science out to a broader community. But this practice can also be reflective and inward and allow us to tell stories to ourselves. Just as the tall statured beech trees had the good fortune to land as a seed in the protected depression, I was lucky to land in a seminar where I got the chance to try being a scientist. And that is my second plant love story origin story. Any questions or thoughts?
We've got some of both. I'll start with a couple questions for you. Was there an increase in submissions during COVID quarantining when more people remained at home and rediscovered their gardens and nature?
That's a great question. I'm going to have to defer to Becky Brock, who's been handling our submission side of things, especially because I started a new job this fall and have been like very much tunnel visioned on teaching. I know we have a huge increase in the number of student submissions, which makes sense. This is the time of year when final projects would come in. And we also made a small conference presentation at the botany conference this summer that was virtual about adding plant love stories to your curriculum. So it's coming back to us.
Another question, do you have any plant love stories that involve an herbarium specimen? And I know the one you just told, you mentioned herbarium specimens.
Yeah, I'm actually, somebody has been reading my notes because my last story is an herbarium love story.
All right, and then we've got lots of plant love stories people have been sharing. I don't know if you want us to read those out now or we can save them to the end.
Yeah, let's save them and yeah, have like a love fest.
That sounds great.
Great.
All right, I'll let you tell us one more love story.
All right. So this is a person love story. I have a 19th century girlfriend. Her name is Annie Sawyer Downs, and she's roughly 140 years older than me. But we both grew up in Massachusetts. We both love the Maine coast. We have weird professional connections to Henry David Thoreau, and we're both botanists who like to verb the noun botanist. We like to say we're going botanizing. I fell in love with Annie when I read her 1892 magazine article, How I Botanize. The things I provide myself with when I go botanizing are a pocket knife, a pair of scissors in a case, a little ball of soft string, and a tin box, which is carried by a strap over my shoulder. I wear a plain skirt, short and full, a round hat with a rim wide enough for shade, a pair of strong gloves with gauntlets, and shoes of sensible thickness with broad soles and low heels. When I go botanizing, I wear trail runners, which, if you think about it, are shoes of sensible thickness with broad soles and low heels. I wear old race t-shirts and athletic clothes made from technical fabric. I wear baseball caps instead of a round hat, and my gloves have magical touchscreen pads on the fingertips because instead of collecting plant specimens in a tin box, I snap pictures and record data on my smartphone. But as much as the attire has changed, botanizing, getting outside and studying plants is almost timeless. In the same article, Annie wrote, "You will need patience, 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 but that is all. There is no magic about it, only attention and perseverance." This motto carried me through my PhD. I found Annie early in graduate school. I was working in Acadia National Park in Maine, where I studied the ecological effects of climate change on plant communities. Studying climate change in New England is tough. Our plant communities have been subjected to a great deal of change. European settlement, agricultural abandonment, waves of development, and plain vanilla year-to-year variation. We've been burning fossil fuels for a long time, coinciding with all of these other processes, and scientists have only recently started looking for the ecological effects of climate change. So while we have a lot of data on current plant communities, the after or during pictures of our planetary makeover, we need more before pictures. Henry David Thoreau is a powerful before picture. His journals contain records of leaf out and flowering in Concord, Massachusetts. The timing of leaf out and flowering, ecologists call this phenology, is tied to spring temperatures. Most plants will bloom early in warm years and later in cool years. And these small phenological events ripple out across an ecosystem. If flowering occurs before pollinators are flying, or if the early leaves of canopy trees shade out the understory wildflowers, there are repercussions for reproduction, competition, and food webs. Long data sets of leaf out and flowering phenology show us how plants respond to changes in climate. Thoreau is not unusual for noticing seasonal changes and recording phenology, but he has influential name recognition. My PhD advisor always refers to the town as Thoreau's Concord, and he loves to use the Thoreau connection to start conversations. With Thoreau, you can talk about climate change without polar bears or icebergs. Thoreau's data is simple and local and recognizable. Thoreau, it turns out, knew my 19th century girlfriend. They were both residents of Thoreau's Concord in the 1840s and 1850s. Annie was born while Thoreau was a Harvard student, and as a kid, she used to follow him through the fields and woods of Concord on botanizing trips. And some 150 years later, I would find myself following my advisor as he followed Thoreau's notes through the fields and woods of Concord. At the beginning of graduate school, I set out to find the Thoreau of the North. I imagined that the archives at Acadia National Park on Mount Desert Island were full of journals as detailed and meticulous as Thoreau's. And in Acadia, I could ignore some of the development pressure that plagues studies in Thoreau's Concord, since Acadia has been a national park since 1916. In the decades before 1916, Mount Desert Island supported farming, fishing, granite quarries, and sawmills. Two groups summered on the island: the wealthy East Coast elites in their lavish hotels and cottages, and the Wabanaki, who had lived on the Maine coast for thousands of years and now set up summer encampments in the villages. Annie was among the summer cottage people. She was a school teacher in Andover, Massachusetts, with a summer house on the island. The island is a little over 100 square miles of granite ridges, glacially carved ponds and wetlands, rolling hills, and rocky intertidal zones. It's less than 1% of Maine's land, but it contains over half of the state's natural plant communities. In 1894, it hosted 680 plant species, including 106 that are locally extinct today. We know this because a group of college boys who bonded over their combined interests in natural history and documenting themselves left behind a goldmine of historical records. These college boys called themselves the Champlain Society. They formed in 1880 in a Harvard dorm room with the intent of spending the summer exploring the natural history of Mount Desert Island. You can see in this picture that I've tried to join them in contemporary times. They kept logbooks of daily entries, which include the Champlain Society flag design, their field excursions, epic poems describing their exploits, photographs of their campsite, and progress towards their natural history goals in the departments of botany, ornithology, and geology. In the winter, they convened dinner parties replete with letterpress printed menus, at which the departments presented annual reports and made plans for the next summer on the island. Membership lasted long after Harvard graduation. The last logbook is from the summer of 1888, and many built summer homes on the island as adults. Their writing is credited with spurring some of the first conversations around conservation on Mount Desert Island. But ultimately, their most incredible contribution is creating a botanist out of a pre-law student and getting him to publish the flora of Mount Desert Island, Maine. Edward Lothrop Rand, the chair of the botanical department, was the lawyer botanist. Rand led the department's effort to compile a complete catalog of plant species on the island. He appears as an earnest and studious kid in the Champlain logbooks. While the other boys row boats across Somme Sound to meet young ladies at the fashionable hotels, Rand cleaves hard to his botanical mission. He graduates from Harvard College, then Harvard Law School. The society breaks up, and yet Rand keeps returning to the island for summer botanizing. The Champlain Society logbooks and the botanical department reports are littered with the names of other scientists and hobbyists who studied the island's ferns, lichens, orchids, and grasses. Rand worked with them all. I copied their names down and searched the archives, hoping that one of these collaborators would have left behind a journal full of historical phenology data. I expected to find my dissertation, my Thoreau. Instead, I found Annie. Annie is cited over 25 times in Rand's Flora. She's the source for a moss, a fern, 4 orchids, a crowberry, a plantain, a catnip, a skullcap, a mint, a bellflower. Still today, there are pressed plants in Harvard's herbaria that Annie collected with Edward Rand. I love thinking about that. Annie was in her 40s, picking specimens of low bush blueberry with this 20-something Harvard nerd. Annie is credited with discovering Rhododendron rhodora forma albiflora, a rhodora with white flowers. Rhodora has deep purple petals with indigo freckles. These shrubs, in the same family as blueberries and huckleberries, bloom before they leaf out, creating the illusion of a plant engulfed in violet. In mid-May, their woody stems hold leaf buds curled tight beneath fat clusters of flower buds. The flower buds expand, deepen in color, and then burst open all at once, while the leaf buds unfurl at a slower pace. My favorite week of the year is Rhodora Week, when the ridges from Cadillac to Sargent are aflame with tunnels of purple rhodora. I'd never heard of a white rhodora. After reading about Annie's white rhodora, I hunted down her specimen at Harvard University's Gray Herbarium. In tight, neat script, Annie records that this flower, pure white, was collected in 1888 on the island. I had never seen a white rhodora until 2013, when I stumbled across a plant with bright white petals in the middle of a patch of standard issue purple rhodora. The white rhodora sat in the saddle between Cedar Swamp Mountain and Sargent Mountain in Acadia. It was my favorite spot that spring. Capturing photographs of it made me feel a kinship with Annie. At the time, I was struggling to track down her notebooks or records. She wrote so meticulously about botany in her magazine pieces that I was sure she must have kept field books full of detailed notes, maybe dates of flowering. But my search came up empty. Finding the white rhodora was like finding a piece of Annie Sawyer Downs alive on the island. I haven't seen it since. The white rhodora is apparently an ephemeral phenomenon. I'm telling the story of Annie Sawyer Downs because her field books, if they existed, didn't make it to posterity. There are no epic poems or hand-drawn flags for her. Her contributions are recorded in scraps of others' stories. She's a citation, a specimen label, a note next to the description of her summer cottage, which is still standing in Southwest Harbor. And yet, this is a lot more than many others were able to leave behind. Annie was a wealthy white woman with leisure time to botanize, and telling her story is a reminder that for every historical record, there are many, many untold stories and many, many botanists who were not recognized as experts, knowledge keepers, or botanists at all. And that's my love story for Annie Sawyer Downs. And with that, I just want to thank everyone for being here and getting to tell these stories. And thank you so much for Joanna for inviting me and all my Plant Love Stories collaborators and colleagues for making this project come together. I'm so happy that, you know, here we are years later and it's still going on after most of us have left the fellowship and moved on.
Thank you, Caitlin, for such a lovely talk and getting to hear these plant love stories. Joanna has gathered all the plant love stories people have been posting and reposted them in the chat so it's easier for us to find them. Great. And Damon Waite, our director, is here and said he's willing to read some of them out for us. Damon, if you want to go ahead and turn on your video and turn your mic on, you can read some from the chat. And Caitlin, if you want to read some too.
Great.
Oh, okay, I'll try one. Let's see. I fell in love with mountain laurel. Someone else wrote this, not me. When I moved to North Carolina from New York State, I fell in love with pitcher plants, especially the seed pods. My origin goes back to growing up on a Wisconsin farm and picking wildflowers in the adjoining woods to make May baskets to deliver to neighboring widows, or the wild showy orchids and yellow lady slippers in an ecological niche in Door County, Wisconsin, while vacationing at just the right time in June. My origin plant is Lonicera sempervirens, coral honeysuckle. This might be a new one or the same one. My garden was started with the peony from my father's garden. He got his peonies from my grandfather, so the ones in my garden have now lived with 3 generations of my family. Over the past 20 years, I've added plants that were beloved by each member of my family. Sadly, none of those plants are native. Okay. You want to do one, Caitlin?
Sure. My plant love story centers on Oenothera fruticosa, the very common yellow sundrops. On May 18th of the spring, I was 22, just after I had resigned as a laborer at another public garden, work not suited to abilities. I took a very free-thinking hike in Duke's Forest, Durham Division. I came around a bend in the forest road to see the shoulder covered by bright yellow flowers for hundreds of feet. I'd never seen so many unplanted flowers in my life in one place. I decided then to add native wildflowers to the trees I was starting to learn as I made myself into a plant ecologist. 18 years later to the day, when my brand new wife, Pat, and I came back to the house she owned, she pulled up her full-length white wedding dress to step into the vigorous stand of yellow sundrops in what was now my garden as well as hers. It's my favorite image from our wedding day, one of great beauty. Oh, that's wonderful.
Do we have time for more, Lauren?
Sure, we've got a couple more. I see there's one in the chat and there's also one in the Q&A.
Okay. Well, Jane says, I love these stories.
Oh, it's the same one. Joanna posted the Q&A one into the chat. So we've got one more.
Okay. Well, I like Jane's comment. She says, I love these stories. They brought tears of appreciation to my eyes. And then here's a new one. My mother-in-law was a botanist. We inherited a first edition copy of Ferns of North America, my favorite book. Our house burned to the ground June 13th, 2013. We were told not to enter the ruins as it was too dangerous. But exactly 3 months later, while wandering in front of what was the library, I saw a glimpse of green and very carefully pulled the burned copy of Ferns of North America from the ruins. The pages had been singed by fire, but the heavy binding protected the contents. Although rain-soaked and beginning to mold, I carefully separated each page and placed it between paper towels, and months later, the plates of fern images were dry and as well preserved as possible. I've since framed many of them with a note: ferns are survivors. Out of the intense heat of a forest fire, their spores germinate and create beauty out of ashes. These ferns are also survivors. Out of the intense heat of a house fire, they survived and provide beauty. Wow, powerful. Thank you for that story.
Well,
So,
thank you.
Joanna, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to thank Caitlin for sharing your time with us today. And thank you, Damon. You go ahead if you have something else you want to share.
Well, I want to thank Caitlin too, but I want everybody on here on this virtual Zoom to really understand how much effort Joanna put into the Year of the Wildflower. It was really a Herculean effort with so many programs and exhibits and the governor's proclamation. And it took Joanna's leadership to pull all that off. And not only that, midway, we got hit with a pandemic, and she adapted and pivoted and kept bringing you Year of the Wildflower content for the whole year. So I know a lot of us are ready to put 2020 in our rearview mirror. I am too, but I think we have a lot to look forward to at the Botanical Garden in 2021. So I just want to wish everyone a very safe and happy holiday season. And thank you all for supporting the garden by participating in our programs.
Thank you, Damon. And truly a team effort on our end. Lauren and David and the whole education crew, our contract instructors, our staff at the garden, both horticulture and conservation and herbarium, all pulling together to make the programs happen this year. So thank you. And I really feel like this quote from Baba Diom, a Senegalese forester that I learned about from our own Alan Weekly at the Botanical Garden, is very fitting to end this conversation. In the end, we will conserve only what we love, and we will love only what we understand. And I think the importance of thinking about our relationships with plants as plant love stories, as Caitlin has shared today, is really a wonderful way to think about this. So please do what you can to connect others with plants, and please share your plant love stories on the Plant Love Stories website and or with us at the Botanical Garden social media sites. We're on Facebook and Instagram at NC Botanical Garden and Twitter at NC Bot Garden. Thank you all for attending, for participating in our programs this year, and we hope that your winter season brings peace and light into your lives. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. It was so lovely to be able to be a part of this and to be at the end of your Year of the Wildflower.
Caitlin, it was a great honor to have you with us. Thank you so much. Bye, everybody.